Okay, I'm about to string up an older Babolat Aero Pro Drive, actually an Aero Pro Drive Plus. And I'm going to try to kill two birds with one stone, or maybe more than two birds with one stone. Besides covering how I'm going to string this racket and why I'm going to string it this particular way, I'm also going to try to address some of the things that have come up in the discussion on the forum. This is for those of you who aren't members of the forum. I'm talking about the Talk Tennis forum. Under the stringing section, we've got a discussion about various around the world patterns, or actually around the world stringing tips is the title of this one. And UK Skippy has brought up a good point, and also Dags brought up something. So let me kind of answer the things that they've brought up, as well as explain the why. So for those guys, you guys have watched the video that I had where I mentioned my so-called golden rule of one-piece stringing and my concern about transitions. Transitioning from mains to crosses or crosses to mains, not only on around the world patterns, but even on a natural one-piece string job where your long side is going to transition to the top cross, or even if you're going to use the short side to do the top cross, you need to look at that transition as well as the transition from the long side to the second cross. So at any rate, I'm assuming those of you watching this kind of are up to speed on that. And there's been some discussion about the universal around the world in particular, specifically because Richard Parnell has a video on YouTube demonstrating how to do the universal around the world pattern, and he's doing it on an Aero Pro Drive. Not this one, this is a little bit older. He's actually got one of these. So this is a 2013 Aero Pro Drive, but these two frames are identical, essentially, other than the paint job. So this one's a bit older. This was the last generation of the Aero Pro Drive, the 2013. And since this one's strung, let me go ahead and try to make this easier for you guys to see. And we'll use this one to point out. So, yes, I'm well aware that Richard Parnell is using this exact racket to demonstrate the universal around the world pattern and claims that it is good for it. I figured I would be challenged on this, so I'm not trying to incite anyone or start World War III or anything like that, but let me explain why in my opinion, I don't think it's a good frame for the around the world pattern. And I know that Richard Parnell didn't indicate this. Also, his video isn't shot straight down on the frame. So for those of you who may not have strung this racket before or be familiar with how close some of the grommets are, I'm shooting not quite straight down on the racket, but a lot more so than his camera angle, which is a bit more of a, not as steeply down on the racket, so you might not be able to tell. But the universal around the world pattern, and everybody knows what I'm talking about who's probably watching this video. So after you do the penultimate main on the long side, it ultimately is going to go fill in the outer main. There's no problem with the spacing here, or going to the bottom, or up the missing outer main on the short side. However, if you look at this racket, especially now that it's strung, and you're looking straight down on it, you can see that the routing of the string on the universal around the world is that this outer main would then flow into the second cross. Not the top cross, because that one's already there as part of the short side and being held over here with a starting clamp. So let's just focus on this outer main and where the second cross is and where they converge here. So this is my setting off tool, which has actually got a little bit of a taper to it, and even the very tip I cannot get in there at all. So let me grab a regular awl, which is obviously thinner, and I can get that in there, but it's only going maybe a third of the length, a little more than a fourth of its length, because obviously this is tapered as well. And so this is stopping almost, is basically, that's how much of that awl I can get in there, because these two grommets are so close together. Now the grommets, the plastic themselves, are not actually touching. I wish I had a current Wilson Pro Staff 97 or an RF 97 to show you guys that strung. These two grommets are even closer together on a current Pro Staff than on this Aero Pro Drive. And I have a question for Paul here in just a minute. But so let me first read what Dag said, because I think it's more important to go through that first, and then I'll jump back to UK Skippy. So Dags had said, do you think the transitions are a real problem or a hypothetical one? I can tell you, I certainly believe it's a real problem, and I don't just think it's a real problem. I've seen it happen. I've seen rackets break, or at least one racket, and it was because of a transition from a cross to a main or a main to a cross. I'll show you in a minute sort of what happened. I was there, I was witness to it. I've written about this before in older threads. Maybe I'll put a link when I type out a response on the forum. I'll put a link to my older posts so that you can see what I've said previously, so rather than rehashing that. But suffice it to say, I've seen it happen. So it's absolutely not a myth. It's not hypothetical. It's not a maybe. It's not a question of if. It's a question of when. And all I can say is, for those who still may not believe that the proximity of these transitions when you're doing one-piece stringing, if you still don't think it's a concern, by and large, most of us know not to string the crosses from the bottom up because of the pressure that gets created. I don't string rackets bottom up, but let me put it to you this way. If you believe, if you're a proponent like I am, that you should not string crosses bottom up, and most of us feel that way, that it creates undue stress on the frame. If you think that creates stress on the frame, stringing crosses bottom up, if you think that creates pressure on the frame, but you don't think that this creates pressure on the frame that can create a failure, then I don't know what I can say to you. I don't remember who said it, maybe Houdini. Somebody said, for those who believe, no explanation is necessary. For those who do not, none will suffice. So if you don't believe that there can be a failure when these grommets are in close proximity to each other, there'll be no convincing you. But I've seen it happen. However, I've never seen a racket crack on the machine that was because it was strung bottom up. I think we all realize that the stress that's created from stringing crosses bottom up has a cumulative effect. It's not something where you're going to see a disastrous consequence right then and there during that particular stringing. I think it weakens the frame over time and then leads to cracking and premature breakage of the frame. That's my belief. Whereas I can tell you that these transition concerns that I've brought up are a real deal thing to be on the lookout for, because you can have a disastrous consequence right there on that given stringing. So like I said, I witnessed it happen. The guy was using an around the world pattern, one that was not particularly well suited. Obviously I don't have the very racket or even the model, but it was a Wilson racket similar to this that had double skips, 7 and 9, and let me move this out of the way. And the transition where the break happened was from the outer main to the third from bottom cross. So it was these two grommets here, outer main to third cross from bottom. And I believe it was the Parnell around the world pattern that he was using. So obviously the two bottom crosses had already been installed with the short side, was now doing the long side, came down with the long side here, did a 270-degree turn through the frame to the third cross from the bottom here, making another 270-degree turn through the frame here to be able to fill in the outer main. So there was actually two places of concern where there was a weakness, and the frame collapsed. I think it was on this side. One of those sides, it collapsed where tension was pulled because those two grommets were just too close together. But it was on a racket very similar to this. And because I've seen it happen, and because it was on the very transitions that I'm calling attention to, move this out of the way. because I've actually seen it happen, I have no question in my mind that it's a real concern. So it's not a hypothetical concern. Dags went on to say certain things are considered bad practice. As an example, stringing the crosses bottom up. True. This is advice usually given to stringers, even though some manufacturers now allow the bottom up stringing with modern frames. Let me mention one thing about that. Yes, I know some of the manufacturers say it's okay to string their frames bottom up. Keep in mind who has the most to gain if your frame does crack. If this pressure, this cumulative pressure from stringing the racket many times bottom up, if this were to lead to the racket cracking at some point, who stands to gain something from that? The manufacturer, not you. So just because a manufacturer says something is okay, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in that. It's sort of akin to if Goodyear or Firestone sold you tires and they said, yeah, it's okay to go ahead and do burnouts in the parking lot with our tires. Go ahead, go for it. Think about why they might be saying that. Does it benefit them, or is it what's for the best care of your frames? So something to think about. So that's my thoughts on the companies that say, oh yeah, it's okay, go ahead and string the racket bottom up. And let me add to that. Even the companies that say it's okay to string our rackets bottom up, one piece. If you look at the instructions for that exact same racket that they say is okay to string bottom up, one piece, when they tell you to string it two piece, after you've tied off the mains, do they tell you to start the crosses here at 7th row or 8th row? Should that be your first cross installed? In other words, when you're stringing it two piece, are they telling you to start at the bottom anyway? No. The companies that say that it's okay to string the racket bottom up, the crosses bottom up, when you go and look at the instructions for how to string that exact same racket two piece, it still tells you to start the crosses at 7 head or 8 head, whatever the top cross is, and go down. So they're giving you conflicting information. They're saying, well, when you're stringing it one piece, yeah, it's okay to string the crosses bottom up. But then they're contradicting themselves. When they say to string it two piece, they're telling you to start from the opposite end. Ask yourself why. So that's what I have to say about the transitions and bottom-up stringing. So Dag said one of the reasons that he brings up the question in my video was that the Aero Pro Drive, I specified the Aero Pro Drive as a poor choice for the Universal around the world. And that's because of this transition. I'll try to hold this straight underneath the camera where you can see it's the transition between the second cross. It'll actually be on this side of the racket if you're doing the Universal. Well, it depends on where your short side is. But these two grommets are really close together. So ask yourself if you're comfortable pulling tension on a 270-degree turn through the frame with these two grommets being this close together on this particular model. Again, Richard Parnell's video, the camera angle isn't straight down on the racket. So it's hard to tell how close that those really are. And if you're not familiar with the racket, you may not know how close those are until you take a good look at it. So Dag said, I can see a certain logic behind thinking that shorter transitions could be problematic, but it isn't something that is widely cited in the way the example of bottom-up stringing is. And I agree, it is not something that is widely cited, but my thinking is, my opinion is that it should be. I think a close transition point is more important than the bottom-up stringing argument, because I've seen it actually fail at that point, and I've never actually seen a frame while being strung fail because it was being strung bottom up. I still don't do that either, but I would say that more stringers should be citing the importance of transitions during any one-piece stringing, whether it's a natural one-piece string job or an around the world, or a box pattern, which is one of the reasons I love a box pattern. I actually enjoy box patterns. They pretty much eliminate all blocked holes. I can do them really fast. But sadly, most rackets are going to have a transition, because I mean, you think about it, there's 3 spots in every corner. So there's like 12 spots that all have to have ample spacing to do the box pattern without putting undue stress on the frame. So I wish that box patterns worked more often, but they don't. When I'm referring to a box pattern, I mean going around 3 times. That's what I call a box pattern. But like I said, so a box pattern involves these kinds of transitions, and I think that it should be mentioned more often. I know that, you know, for those of us that have been stringing for some time, if you're new to stringing, it doesn't take long before someone's going to point out to you that you shouldn't string the crosses from the bottom to the top. Most of us kind of learn that fairly early on, but I think that there's been a lot of neglect in that we haven't shared the information regarding these transitions, and I think that that is important. And yes, I will concede the fact that the frames that are made today are probably stronger than the frames that were made 20, 30 years ago, even though they're graphite rackets. So yes, the frames may be stronger now than they had been, but I still don't think that that's good enough reason to tempt fate by these transitions. Oh, and by the way, the racket that I was mentioning that the failure occurred on, it was, like I said, it wasn't this racket, but it was about the same age. The racket was not very old at the time. This original BLX line was what, 2010, 2011, I think, from Wilson, and it was out of that era. And the racket hadn't been strung many times. It was probably only getting strung for maybe its second time, third time. I don't know. The racket was in good shape and was not that old, and so it was a modern racket. It wasn't some old relic from 30 years ago that had been strung 50 times, or was, you know, arguably a weaker graphite used than high modulus graphite now, or something like that. So I don't buy into the argument that, oh, the frame was already damaged, or that it was an old racket, or anything like that. It was a modern racket that failed because of two transitions being too close together and using the wrong type of pattern for that racket. So, sorry to belabor the point on that. So, and I'll also mention this. Yes, Richard Parnell in his video does not mention the proximity, the closeness of these two grommets when he's doing that universal around the world pattern. Also, if you go and watch Richard Parnell's video on the Parnell around the world, which is a variation of the universal. It's the one that was being used on that Wilson frame that broke. The short side does several of the mains on the short side, then it loops around and takes care of the bottom cross, the second from bottom cross, and then loops back up to the penultimate main, and then the top cross, and it's held with a starting clamp. So basically, the short side does what the universal around the world pattern does, except that it also takes care of these two bottom crosses very early on. So those are already installed. Then you get to work on the long side, which goes down the rack, just like the universal, goes down, across, back up, and into the second cross, and you do all these. But when you go down with the long side on the outer main, because these two are already here, you have to loop from the outer main to the third from bottom cross, as I mentioned on this racket, and that's where the close proximity was. So if you go watch his video, which he's actually stringing a squash racket, not a tennis racket at the time, but he comments that for rackets that have two crosses below where the outer main comes in, that it works really well, like the Pure Drives. He does not call any attention to the proximity of these grommets where the outer main transitions to the third cross from the bottom, or where the third cross from the bottom transitions to the outer main on your short side. So he didn't call attention to the grommet proximity on the Parnell ATW in that video, even though he was doing it on a squash racket, but he was talking about some tennis rackets that might be applicable. And so he doesn't mention it on the universal. So I'm fully aware that what rackets he's stringing and which ones he's talking about, and that he's not calling attention to potential problem spots. So I just wanted to mention that. So let's see. So Paul, UK Skippy, had said he was kind of defending the universal around the world. And again, I'm not against the universal ATW. I just think there's some rackets where it doesn't work great. I wouldn't use it on a Prince Original Graphite. I wouldn't use it on this racket, even though Richard Parnell is actually using this racket to demonstrate it because of this proximity of the transition. And again, I wish I had a current Pro Staff, an RF 97 or a regular 97. If you look at the spacing is even closer on a current Pro Staff between the second cross and the outer main right here. These two plastic grommets are almost touching each other. I can barely get the very, very tip of this awl between there. So my question to you, Paul, is if you were stringing this racket or a modern pro staff, one piece, full bed, do you feel comfortable using the universal, say on a modern pro staff, with these two grommets being super, super close together? Because the reason I asked Paul that is he said the idea behind it is that the outer main on the long side will go down the frame, across the bottom, back up the outer main on the short side, and then continue with the rest of the crosses, which of course means that it transitions here to the second cross. It says that's it. It should work on every frame. And I guess that's why they're, you know, in theory, why it's called the universal is it should work on every frame, but in my opinion, it doesn't. So again, I would say, Paul, do you yourself feel comfortable making that kind of a transition with those two grommets being 2 millimeters apart? So Paul went on to say there's some downsides to the ATW patterns. They tend to lie with uneven stress being placed on the frames during the stringing process because the patterns which leave out the outer mains initially while stringing the crosses will put some undue stress on the frame, potentially pulling it out of shape. So I'm not arguing that that occurs. He also said that there's also the issue of when you finally do go to fill in the outer mains which have been missing once the crosses have already been completed, that would lead to the tension being lower on these outer mains than if they had been strung without the intersections and the additional friction that the crosses now pose, which is absolutely true. I completely agree that by filling in these two outer mains at the end of the pattern, that these two strings are going to be something less than they would have been had they been installed unfettered by the crosses being there already. Absolutely. How much less, I don't know. Obviously, they're going to be less than the other ones because they're a shorter string anyway. If you really feel like it makes a difference, I suppose you could bump up the tension the way a lot of people do for tying knots. So if it makes you feel better, you know, ramp up your tension on these outer mains if you're doing a pattern that has these installed late in the game rather than early on. So I completely agree that those are going to be something less. I don't really think it matters. I don't think that anybody would notice the difference in feel of just the outer mains being at a lower tension than all of the other, versus if you strung the other racket and these had full reference tension. And there may or may not be some truth to the frame being subjected to undue stress by doing all of the mains except for the outer mains. In other words, if there's 16 mains, we're putting in 14 mains and then getting to work on all the crosses, and then at the end, at some point, we're installing these outer mains. And I have not seen any empirical evidence to support that the frame is being subjected to undue stress by doing these two mains late in the game rather than early on. That may be true. If there's some proof of that, if there's somewhere that some research has been done on that and documented, I'd be happy to look that over. So if anybody knows of some research that's been done or study, please let me know. Maybe it'll change my mind. But my feeling is that I don't think, you know, with, I don't know percentages that good. 14 out of 16 being installed, whatever percentage that is, if we've got that percentage of the mains done, I think that most of the pressure and the stress, and these are the shortest mains at that, so I don't know that installing those is creating a whole lot more stability to the frame before we get set to doing the crosses. Yes, they'll have less tension, but I don't know that they're really stabilizing the frame that much more by having the 15th and 16th main installed as opposed to not having it installed. And I think that the trade-off is I would rather leave these two mains out, select an around the world pattern that happens to leave these two outer mains out until the end of the pattern. If it was a pattern that kept me from, you know, if it avoided these close transition points, by all means I think that that's a much better trade-off to have these two outer mains at a slightly less tension. I think that that's a pretty good concession to make if it avoids problematic transitions. So I would never personally select, say, the universal around the world. There aren't that many around the world patterns that do get all of the mains installed before you start the crosses. The universal kind of does that. The Parnell around the world kind of does that. But the Dire Desire, the UK RSA, the short side around the world, they all omit an outer main. At least I will say this, at least if you choose one of those, like the Dire Desire around the world, or the UK RSA around the world, or the short side around the world, even though you're omitting a single outer main on each side, at least the racket is still balanced. You don't have one or two more strings done on one side than, say, the other. And so the tension on these outer mains is going to be, relatively speaking, the same. Whatever minor tension loss you have due to the friction when you pull these strings, it's going to be the same on each side, which is different than, say, if you're doing the generic around the world where you don't need a starting clamp. You actually have, let's say the racket has 16 mains, you have 8 mains done on one side, the short side, but only 7 mains done on the right side, and then you're doing all the crosses down to the bottom and then filling in that outer main that's missing at the end of the racket, but only on one side. So in that situation, you can make an argument of there's a slight imbalance because one of them was done early on and one was done very late, and so one had a lot more friction involved than the other. But most of the other around the world patterns either omit both of them early on and then they both get installed later, or like the Universal and the Parnell ATW, those are actually done, relatively speaking, early on outside of the bottom cross or the bottom 2 crosses. But I think that if you choose that type of a pattern, say the universal around the world, just so that your priority is to have these 2 outer mains at full reference tension without any friction involved by the crosses yet you have to incur a very close transition like this, I don't think that's a good trade-off. I would much rather choose a different around the world pattern that avoided these transitions where I've seen a racket break, in favor of installing these outer mains later in the game. So what I'm saying is, to echo what I already said and what UK Skippy had already said, is not every around the world pattern is perfect. They all have pros and they all have cons, and that's why I think the very first thing that I look at when I'm about to do an around the world pattern are where are the problem transitions and how can I avoid those. So let me go through my little list of around the world patterns and get to one that doesn't make me have to make a compromise on these transitions. And if that's the universal, fine. If it's the Parnell, fine. But oftentimes it isn't. So just look at your transitions, and I mean, if you agree with me, you're going to think the transitions are important, and in which case you might want to look into other patterns besides only the universal or only the Parnell. There's other advantages and stuff, but I'm just saying from that standpoint. But again, I realize I'm not going to convince everybody, but that's my position, and the hows and the whys of why I choose around the world patterns or even natural one-piece string jobs on those basis, or on that criteria. So hopefully, I realize I've rambled on and on, but. So now, so both of these rackets have the same pattern. If you're stringing this racket 2-piece, the tie-offs are down here at 6 throat for the mains, and your crosses tie off at 7 head and 10 throat. And for those of you who have strung this racket 2-piece, all of us know that you're tying off your bottom cross onto the second from bottom cross, which has always been a tight tie-off right here because that grommet is right up against the outer main. So I usually use a pro knot there instead of the Parnell knot that I almost always use. But when you're considering around the world patterns, another thing to think about is where will the last 2 strings that are tensioned prior to tying off be? And so, for example, if you string this racket with the universal around the world pattern, as Richard Parnell does in his video, the top cross will get tied off, the short side / top cross will get tied off up here at 7 head. But the last cross that you're installing after you do all these crosses will be the second cross from the bottom. And on some rackets, this racket in particular, that's the last string exiting, and then you'll need to tie off. However, it ties off at the very grommet that you're exiting. So you can't tie off in the same hole that you're coming out. So you would either have to do one of two things here. When you were on, so this is the 18th cross. So you would have to do the 16th cross, and then instead of doing the 17th and then 18th, and then having to tie off the 18th somewhere other than its natural intended grommet here at 10 throat, what you would need to do is skip over a hole, kind of like the old trick where you're pinning down the end of the bumper guard on both sides, is you would have to skip over and then come back. It's a little bit like doing a Yonex loop. But so at this point, what you would do is you would string, what is this, 19, 18, so the 16th cross would be going this way, and then normally the 17th, and then normally the 18th, and you'd be emerging from the grommet, but then have seemingly nowhere to tie off. So what you could do is when you did the 16th going this way, instead of doing the 17th this way, you would do the 18th going this direction, then loop back around and then install the 16th, the 17th in between these two. So now this would be a hard weave, but at least it has you exit one grommet away from where you need to tie off. So you'd still be able to use the 10 throat grommet tie off by going from 16 to 18 to 17 and then being able to tie off right next door. Or you'd have to do what Richard Parnell does in his video, which is prior to stringing the Racket, he took an awl and enlarged this grommet because he knew that he was going to come out the standard grommet, which is designed to be tied off, and he tied off up here, if memory serves. I haven't reviewed the video, but I remember him having to open up a grommet prior to starting the Racket. He doesn't show that, but he mentions that he had prepped the grommet so that he'd be able to tie off there because he knew that he wasn't going to be able to tie off in the normal spot. And obviously he didn't want to do what I just said the alternative was, which was to skip and then come back through. So I don't think that this particular frame, actually, there's a lot of around the world patterns that I believe don't work so well. I already explained why the universal around the world isn't great on this Racket because of this transition right here, and it's only because of that one spot. All the other transitions have plenty of space. I wouldn't use the UK RSA around the world pattern on this Racket because the short side, which has been held with a starting clamp, later on, once you resume with the short side, it fills in this outer main, has to make a 270-degree turn through the frame between these two grommets here. So you're transitioning from outer main to second from bottom cross, and that's not the closest, but not the furthest either. So that's the section I would be concerned about using the UK RSA around the world on this frame. I obviously wouldn't do a box pattern on this one. The Dire Desire around the world, you would also have transitions at the very end of the pattern when you're doing the around the world portion. When you install the outer, you have to go outer main, second cross, which you had previously omitted, outer main, bottom cross. You'd be transitioning from outer main to second cross here and second cross to outer main here. In other words, it's the same spots that are of concern with the universal around the world, but you now have two of them rather than just one. So I wouldn't use the Dire Desire around the world pattern on this one. The generic around the world pattern without the starting clamp also would not be particularly good choice on this Racket either because it has an odd number of mains. You do your short side and tie it off. Your long side you do all but one, and this penultimate main comes up and has to transition from this grommet down to the second. Actually, so it would be okay. The generic around the world would be all right. I was thinking about this transition here. So you would be doing penultimate main down to second cross, and then the third would be going this way, the 5th, 7th, the 9th, all the way down to the 19th, ending back on this side, making a 90-degree turn here, plenty of room here, coming up, plenty of room between here and the top cross, and then tie off. So the generic around the world would not pose a problem on here. However, you would have 8 mains done on one side and only 7 on the other, as we talked about. So what I'm going to do on this Racket is the short side around the world pattern, which is the same pattern that Irvin was talking about earlier. He just didn't specify it as being the short side around the world pattern. And this pattern was created, or at least I saw first documentation of this pattern, this so-called short side around the world pattern, was by John Google. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. Gugel. Google. So he had it on, I can't remember if it was the GSS site or AIRT, one of the sites back around 2011, 2012. So almost a decade ago, he had an article on it, or a description of this pattern, and claimed it was a short, this around the world pattern had no hard weaves and no blocked holes. And so what you do is basically, your short side is going to be long enough to do all of the crosses, all of the mains on the short side, so all 8 in this case, plus it'll also do the bottom cross, a single bottom cross, a single outer main here on the long side, and the top cross. So the whole box, outer main, bottom cross, outer main, top cross, is all done with the short side. So your short side is longer than probably any other around the world pattern calls for. So when I do this racket, I'm going to be stringing this with a full bed of poly, RPM blast at 52 pounds. And I'm going to cut 34 feet from the reel, and I'm going to use 11 feet 3 inches for my short side. And I'll comment about, you possibly would need more length than that on your short side, because what you have to do is 7 of the 8 mains with the short side, and then that string, that penultimate main, is held on the outside of the racket with a starting clamp. So you've got this big long tail emerging from the starting clamp here, and that big long tail, you then, the premise was, the way it was written up initially, is you're supposed to route that short side tail down this outer main, across the bottom cross, up the outer main on the long side, and the top cross, but not tension any of it. The tension is only on the first 7 mains in the racket. So this string is here, all of these periphery strings are in there, but they're limp, they're not tensioned. You're going to tension them at the very end of the pattern. And by them being there early on, you don't have any hard, and them not being tensioned yet, you won't have any hard weaves, and that string will already be routed through any holes that potentially would have been blocked holes had you not pre-routed that string through the frame. And when I use the short side around the world pattern, sometimes I advance that string ahead the way it was written up, and sometimes I don't. It just depends on how many blocked holes there's going to be. But if you do it the way it was written, to have this short side long enough to string these 7 mains, hold this with a starting clamp, and then leave a loop emerging from the starting clamp long enough to not only reach your tensioner and then come back and then go all the way around the periphery, it requires a lot of string. And if you're cutting string from reels like I am, you don't want to cut. You're going to have to cut an extra 2-3 feet of length to be able to accomplish all of that the way it was written. Now, if you're stringing from sets of string where you don't have to be worried about conserving anything at all, by all means, you know, you could measure off 7 racket lengths or whatever and have a gracious plenty to reach the tension head and have all this string laced through there early on. But what I do is I don't want to cut more string from my reels than I have to, especially if it's a more expensive string like RPM Blast. So I'm only going to cut the string the way I would normally without adding any additional length to it. So I'm going to cut 34 feet. In other words, if I was stringing this racket with a universal around the world pattern or some other around the world pattern, I would still be using 34 feet. And normally, the short side around the world pattern, you would need to cut a longer length because of this long loop that you have to leave in place and then pre-thread this. But if you have a second starting clamp, if you've got 2 starting clamps, one which will be here holding that penultimate main on the short side, and another which you can rig for bridging to the tension head, you won't have to leave a massive loop of string protruding from the starting clamp over here. You can leave a much shorter loop here, and then you can advance the periphery strings through the frame if you want to, because then later you don't need, say, 3 feet of string emerging, a big loop that's 3 feet long, to be able to reach your tension head, allow your tension head to get to the tension point, and then that loop of string coming back to the frame and going in here. You can just grab that short loop with a second starting clamp that's set up for bridging, and you can avoid having to do and then you won't have to pull 3 feet of string through here, and then 3 feet of string through here, and 3 feet of string through here, and 3 feet of string through the top cross, and have this big long extra piece when you finally are ready to tension your top cross at the end. So I'm going to cut the length of string from the reel like I would any other time, and this little trick prevents me from having to have a massive loop over here. And I still probably won't pre-install that string. I've found that I've tried it both ways, and by having that string in there, all those periphery strings, and them sitting in there limp, it becomes more of a headache than it's worth for me, unless by doing so allows me to eliminate a blocked hole somewhere. So on certain frames, you might need to route that string all the way around. Like on this racket, the top cross here, which goes through 8 head on both sides, as soon as you tension this outer main on the short side, you will block that hole. So if you haven't routed that string all the way through, because this is where the tail of the top cross will be emerging later on, if you don't have that string already through that hole before you tension this outer main, you'll have a blocked hole here. And the whole point of, or one of the big advantages of the short side around the world pattern was that it has no blocked holes and no hard weaves. So if you want to do that and have that string all there, you're going to have a very long piece of string. Now on other rackets, this racket has a single skip at the head and the throat. However, for rackets that have 2 skips, it actually works out better on rackets like this where you've got 2 skips, say 7 and 9 head, 7 and 9 throat, or 8 and 10, 8 and 10, because when you tension this outer main, you're not blocking this grommet on the top cross. In fact, on this racket, if you're using the short side around the world pattern, the grommet here at 7 head remains open throughout. It never gets blocked. So you don't necessarily have to have the string advanced all the way around and through there on a racket like this. And also, this one would also not be blocked. So the last grommet that would actually be blocked is, I believe, this one right here. So 9 throat. So as long as you've got that short side long enough and pre-laced that you've got it inserted through this 9 throat grommet, you don't have to actually have this outer main and the top cross already in place, because those grommets aren't blocked anyway on a racket like this. But with the single skips like this, that'll get blocked. The penultimate main on the long side will transition from here to the second cross. So you'll be passing over 2 grommets here. So you will be creating 2 blocked holes here, but just plan accordingly and you plan ahead. So you can either pre-lace that string all the way around and not have to worry about any of this, or you can just deal with the blocked holes in your customary manner. And I would rather not have all that string sitting in there limp just to get through those holes. I don't mind putting a ribbon on the outside of the frame here and pulling down on it, and these blocked holes won't be a problem at all anyway. So the way I see it is, it's worth it to get this string advanced through certain holes, but maybe not all of them all the way up through the top cross. So like, I'll place a ribbon here and I'll place a ribbon up here, and this won't be blocked. So some will be blocked here and some won't. But I'm going to use the short side around the world pattern, and also the last string that is tensioned with the long side will be the second cross from the bottom, similar to the universal around the world pattern, which means I won't be able to tie off here at 10 throat in the customary spot. So I'm in the same little predicament that I talked about a minute ago. If you choose to use the universal around the world pattern, is where are you going to tie off? So what I'm going to do is this string will actually be going in this direction. My final cross string with the long side is going to be going in this direction. So that 18th cross will be going here. It'll go out this grommet, which I obviously cannot tie off at because I'm emerging from that grommet. So what I will do is just bring my tail down here to 6 throat and tie off down here, where you would tie off the mains if you were stringing this 2-piece. And that might seem, I know a lot of people are like, oh, that's so far away. You know, I want to tie off right next door. And if you want to enlarge a grommet right here, like Parnell did, you can do that. But here's the way I'm looking at it. It's really not that big a deal, because if you string this racket 2-piece, you're exiting this grommet right here at 9 throat, and you're tying off at 6. And what I'm talking about doing is emerging from 10 throat, which is what, 5 millimeters further up. So if you string this racket two-piece, you're going from this spot to tie off anyway. So going from here down to here, I would rather make this slightly longer run on the outside of the frame to tie off down here at 6th throat in a grommet that was designed for it, than to take an awl and remount this grommet and make the wall of that grommet thinner and make that grommet potentially fail sooner. So I'm all in favor of tying off at designated tie-off points whenever possible and not having to open up other grommets. So I don't think that this is a bad way to go, and it won't really create any issues. So you'll see that if you watch the whole video of me stringing this racket. So the short side will go all the way around and will ultimately get tied off up here. That long side will do all the crosses, with the last cross that the long side takes care of being the 18th, which will emerge here and come down here and be tied off at 6th throat. So I'm going to get the string measured off the reel and we'll be back.